speaker for his remarks and recognising members of government from Oxford A.
Okay, what we want to bring you on this side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, is an actual analysis of the two kinds of competing rights that exist, the rights to your own people and the rights to the global community in general. We're going to derive exactly where those rights come from and tell you why the second one is more important in cases of extreme need and why extreme need is distinctive. And we're also going to talk to you about the problem of compassion fatigue and how we think, generally speaking, this is going to mitigate that and make people more compassionate towards the developing world. Before that, a bit of a rebuttal to what they say, because a lot of it is really, really offensive. And I think we need to deal with that. So the first thing they say is, firstly, that, instead of this, just give aid to the developing world, which really is about, mischaracterizes the nature of the long-term, short-term division. There is no mutual exclusivity between giving aid to the developing world and also allowing the most extreme people in dire poverty to come to our country. There is clearly a generation of people who will die, no matter how much aid we give to these countries. We want to protect them from dying because by bringing them to the country. We just don't think there's any contradiction there at all. Then they say, and this is the really offensive argument, it's, persecution, and it's stood on persecution, that's fine criteria, but not poverty, because poverty is not an immutable characteristic. But, people who are poor can, just work their way up and they just try hard enough. And even the reason that they're actually poor is because they're not working hard enough. No, thank you. The idea that someone living on absolutely no money, struggling with, 5 children and no access to labour, possibly abused maybe within their own community in Burkina Faso, can ever work their way into being a sort of rich middle-class person who will develop the rest of their economy, thank you, is frankly unbelievably offensive. Tell that person that you actually don't deserve the same treatment as someone who believes in it, thank you, because you could actually work your way out is unbelievable, ladies and gentlemen. We think it just totally misunderstands just how extreme the poverty is in these countries. Then they say, oh, when they come here, they won't have the ability to work and they'll just be really abused. No, thank you. No, that's not true. Obviously, before their asylum claim is processed, they can't work. Once it's processed and it's demonstrated that they are people who have extreme need and extreme poverty in their own country, they will be able to work in this country. Just like in Britain, rural asylum seekers do have rights to work and rights to access social security benefits. And if the point is, they'll be abused by people, they'll be really resented, or they won't be able to access these rights. That's the reason for government to give them good information, give them strong legal protection, try and protect their rights. No, thank you. Not to just say, you'll never be able to access the rights here because we're a bad government. Just go back to your own awful government. I mean, that's ridiculous. Then they said, this I think was probably the most important argument they've given you. They didn't really make it particularly strongly, but they said, millions of people will come, there'll be loads of people will come, and that's going to really swamp the system. We actually don't think that's true, because we think under the status quo, those who can come, those who have any ability to try and come, always do, right? They try their absolute best to come because their situation is so dire. So even the expectation, even the probability that they'll be able to work as an illegal immigrant or that they'll somehow have their application processed, they still try and come and they still try and make it. Most people probably won't be able to access that anyway, but we think it's far better that when a few people do manage to get through, we don't just send them back to die. We think that's particularly important. Thank you. And then finally they said, they made a huge amount out of this. We don't have a standard. We have no idea which people we're going to do. Sorry, we don't have an obligation to be a World Bank working group here and work out the exact standard that we're going to give you. But we say all of these criteria about extremity are always to some extent arbitrary. We don't think that's a reason to reject the entire policy. Surely some people won't be able to get when they do deserve it. Fine. We think on the whole the policy will work. No, thank you. Okay, on to this idea about where we think these two competing principles derive. So we think one is a sort of idea of the social contract and an obligation to your own state, and the other is an obligation to humanity. So why do we intuitively think that there is an obligation to one's own state? Well, we think not for particularly good reasons, actually. Usually people, I'll say people actually know, normally we think of them as sort of maybe paying taxes and therefore having sort of having some sort of stake in the community in general. We think that's just not actually, that doesn't really follow, right? Because there are loads of people who are wards of the state, people who are children, people who are disabled, people who are permanently unemployed. All these people don't contribute anything to the state, but we still give them a lot of obligation, we still give them lots of rights under the status quo. So what do we think it is actually? We think ultimately it's probably completely arbitrary and done for purely pragmatic reasons. The reason why we have a state system as opposed to a world government is because we think a world government is too unwieldy for a centralized bureaucracy to try and deal with. So we try and demarcate the world into smaller regions which can be locally governed. That's the reason we have it. But we don't think any real rights claims flow from the fact that we happen to be part of that same geographical territory. We think on the whole, all of them are pretty much arbitrary. They're historically arbitrary. There's since a lot of them are just, written, drawn by colonial rulers, a lot of, as in literally physical rulers. And we think, okay, I'll take it 1 second. They've been saying for a while. And we think that's the end. So we think there's actually a much bigger obligation to humanity. Okay.
So just acknowledge that those who can come will attempt to. Don't you think that your policy of open-ended immigration effectively creates room for people?
We say under the status quo, people who can come, do try and come. We say if those people have extreme need, we shouldn't send them back. So thank you. We don't think we'll get more people under our policy. That's the analysis we give. Where do we think the obligation to humanity arises from, and why is it so specifically the case of extreme need? We think ultimately the ability to self-actualize, to pursue life projects, to define yourself as an individual, and to exact goals that make you feel fulfilled, to be able to do things in your life and actually feel like there is some purpose to that life and somewhere, some direction that you're going is the basis of humanity. And thank you. We think just subsisting, just existing in pain, not being able to look after your family, just trying to survive from day to day, being most of the time often being able to physically, not being able to physically move, not being able to change your job, so often not being able to work in any way, being discriminated against every moment just because of your economic position. We think those sorts of things actually are actually relegated almost to the position of animal. We think that is fundamentally the worst and most insecure people in the world. We think those are people, ladies and gentlemen, that there is a basic obligation that trumps any obligation that might exist towards your own state. That doesn't mean let everyone in who in any sense might be poor, but it means those extremely poor people. That's a right we think they deserve, and as fellow human beings, we deserve to protect. Finally, on this idea of compassion fatigue. Because what we think, ladies and gentlemen, is that at the moment there is a feeling, there is a sort of fatigue because it's sort of almost depressingly distant, right? We see news programs with poor and starving Africans, and we say, well, that's really sad, I really can't access that because it's too far away. But one thing that we do see is we have sort of personal and regularized contact with people who have come to this country, but probably from regimes where they're being persecuted or being abused by the people. So what conception do we have of the developing world? We think they're corrupt regimes full of persecutors who abuse people. We think that's a function of the fact that the only people we actually have day-to-day contact to, the people we hear the stories of, are actually people who have been persecuted and abused. Under our policy, we get a lot more people who have had difficult lives through no fault of their own, through extreme economic need, through extreme poverty. We say that regularizes, but that makes us more empathetic towards the idea of extreme need, and actually makes us much more likely to try and help the developing world. For these reasons, we urge you to support this motion.